There is a number that every American driver saw at the pump this week and felt before they even processed what it meant. $4 a gallon. The national average retail price of gasoline in the United States crossed that threshold for the first time in more than 3 years, according to GasBuddy price tracking data released Monday. The last time that number appeared at filling stations across the country was August 2022, in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when emergency oil stockpiles were being tapped and global energy markets were in freefall. That moment passed, prices came back down, and the political lesson learned from 2022 was absorbed so thoroughly by the incoming Trump administration that energy prices became one of the central commitments of the campaign that put it in power. Drill more, produce more, lower the price. That was the promise. The Iran war did the opposite. Subscribe to From Report right now and activate the notification bell, because what follows is not a conversation about fuel costs in isolation. It is an analysis of how a military operation conceived without an adequate accounting of its energy market consequences is now delivering those consequences directly to the household budgets of American families who had no vote in the decision that started it. The $4 threshold carries significance that goes beyond the number itself. Economists and consumer behavior analysts describe it as a psychological barrier, a price point at which the cost of fuel stops being an inconvenience that households absorb and starts being a daily decision that restructures how families spend money. When the number at the pump is $3.50, most American households adjust. They complain, they notice, and they continue operating largely as before. When the number crosses $4, something different happens. The calculation becomes visible in a way it was not before. Families begin weighing whether a trip is necessary. Decisions about commuting, shopping locations, weekend travel, and discretionary spending shift. Small business owners who operate vehicle fleets feel input costs rising faster than they can pass them through to customers. Agricultural producers, whose operations depend on diesel fuel for equipment and transportation, watch their margins compress in ways that eventually reach the prices consumers pay for food. The $4 threshold is not just an energy number. It is the point at which the conflict's consequences stop being a foreign policy story and become a personal finance story for a significant portion of the American public. The trajectory that produced this week's milestone began the moment the United States and Israel launched operations against Iran at the end of February. National average retail gasoline prices have climbed approximately $1.06 per gallon, a 36% increase since that operation began. To put that figure in concrete household terms, a family with 2 vehicles filling up weekly is now spending roughly $85 to $100 more per month on fuel than they were spending before the war started. Over the course of a year, that figure approaches $1,200 in additional fuel expenditure per household. That is not a rounding error in a family budget. For the 55% of respondents in a Reuters Ipsos poll who said their household finances had taken at least some toll from rising gas prices, and for the 21% who said the impact was significant, those numbers are already a lived reality. They are visible every few days at the pump. They are felt at the grocery store, where transportation costs have passed through to food prices. They are present in every delivery fee, every contractor quote, and every freight cost that has been adjusted upward to account for the fuel environment that the Iran operation created. The oil market dynamics driving the pump price movement are directly traceable to the operational decisions made in the conduct of this war. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of globally traded seaborne crude oil and a significant share of liquefied natural gas normally pass, has been functionally closed to Western commercial shipping since Iranian naval and mining operations began in the early days of the conflict. That closure alone placed sustained upward pressure on global crude prices from the opening week of operations. The damage to South Pars, the strikes near Ras Laffan, the disruption to Qatar's LNG production capacity, and the drone attacks on Gulf port infrastructure have compounded that pressure by removing additional supply nodes from the global system simultaneously. U.S. oil futures settled Monday at $102.88 per barrel, up $3.24 in a single session, a movement that came in part after Kuwait reported an oil tanker had been attacked at a Dubai port. A single incident report from a single Gulf port moved crude prices by more than $3 in one trading session. That is the sensitivity of the current market. That is how thin the margin between current prices and the next threshold has become. The political dimension of the $4 milestone is one that requires no analytical inference. It is explicit in the record. Donald Trump made energy price reduction a central campaign commitment, repeated it throughout the transition period, and entered office with it as a stated first-term deliverable. The framing was consistent and unambiguous. American energy dominance would translate into lower costs for American consumers, and the administration's deregulatory and production expansion agenda would deliver that result. The pump price that American drivers are seeing this week is up 36% since the administration launched a military operation that was added to its policy agenda after that commitment was made. The midterm elections are approximately 7 months away. The political mathematics of a 36% fuel price increase in an election year are not complicated. They are the same mathematics that contributed materially to the political outcomes that ended the previous administration's majority. Raymond James analyst Pavel Molchanov noted this week that while the current crisis rhymes with the post-Ukraine invasion price spike of 2022, expectations are that the current disruption may resolve more quickly. During the 2022 episode, prices remained above $4 for 23 weeks. Whether the current conflict produces a shorter or longer disruption window depends on variables: the pace of any ceasefire process, the status of Hormuz shipping lanes, the condition of Gulf energy infrastructure that are not currently moving in a direction that supports a rapid resolution. The administration has attempted to address the energy price consequences of its military operation through a series of policy responses, the most significant of which has been a waiver of the Jones Act shipping law. The waiver temporarily permits foreign-flagged vessels to move fuel, fertilizer, and other goods between American ports, a measure intended to ease domestic supply constraints by increasing the flexibility of the fuel distribution system. Industry analysts have been direct about the expected impact: marginal. The Jones Act waiver addresses a domestic logistics constraint. It does not address the global crude price signal being driven by the Strait of Hormuz closure, the removal of Gulf LNG capacity, and the accumulated disruption to energy infrastructure across the region. Treating a global supply disruption with a domestic logistics adjustment is the policy equivalent of opening a window in a burning building. The gesture is real. The impact on the fire is not. The energy price consequences of this conflict are not contained within American borders, and the political pressure they generate is not limited to the American electoral calendar. The same crude price dynamics that are delivering $4 gasoline to American filling stations are moving through every import-dependent economy on Earth. Countries that produce none of their own oil and depend entirely on seaborne imports through trade routes that connect to the Gulf are experiencing price shocks proportionally more severe than what American consumers are absorbing. In the European context, markets that were already navigating elevated energy costs from the restructuring of Russian gas supply relationships following 2022 are now facing a compounding disruption from the Gulf. Natural gas prices on European benchmarks have spiked significantly since Qatari LNG production was disrupted, adding a heating and industrial energy dimension to the transportation fuel pressure that crude price movements are driving globally. The interconnection of global commodity markets means that a conflict conducted in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea corridor is simultaneously a cost of living event in Seoul, a supply chain disruption in Mexican manufacturing, a food price pressure in sub-Saharan Africa, and a political liability in every importing nation whose government made commitments about economic stability that the energy market disruption is now contradicting. The phrase energy independence, used consistently by governments across the political spectrum to describe their relationship to domestic production, does not describe immunity from global pricing mechanisms. A country that produces all the oil it consumes domestically still prices that oil at global market rates because the alternative, selling below the market, is economically irrational for the private companies operating within it. There is no energy independence from a global commodity price signal. There is only exposure that is more or less direct depending on the structure of the domestic market. The economic analysts who have been shaping institutional responses to the current price environment have identified a specific threshold that carries consequences beyond the current disruption level. Jeremy Siegel, economist at WisdomTree, framed the core dynamic precisely. The key issue is not crude oil prices in isolation. It is visible gasoline prices, the number that consumers see multiple times per week at filling stations, that registers psychologically as a signal about household economic conditions, and that translates political sentiment in ways that aggregate economic statistics do not capture. When that visible number crosses $4, it reaches a territory where the psychological effect begins reshaping consumer behavior and political sentiment simultaneously, regardless of what the underlying economic data says. Reports indicate that if crude prices continue at their current trajectory, driven by the Hormuz closure and accumulating Gulf infrastructure damage, the next significant price threshold, levels that would place retail gasoline prices in territory not seen since the peak disruption events of the past decade, is within the range that current market conditions could reach without a material change in the conflict's direction. The strategic irony embedded in the current situation is one that defense analysts across the ideological spectrum have been documenting with increasing frequency. The stated objectives of the operation under which this conflict was launched included securing American energy interests in the region, ensuring that Iranian influence over Gulf energy infrastructure and shipping lanes could not be used as leverage against American allies and global markets. The operational outcome of the operation's first month has been the temporary realization of the precise outcome it was designed to prevent. Iranian influence over Gulf energy flows, exercised through the Hormuz closure, the mine warfare campaign, the Ghadir submarine operations, and the drone and missile strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, is currently higher than it was before the operation began. The leverage that Iranian control of regional shipping lanes provides over global energy price signals is being exercised in real time in the trader activity that moved crude prices $3 in a single Monday session. The $4 gasoline that American drivers are paying this week is the consumer-facing output of that leverage. The operation designed to reduce Iranian energy leverage has, in its first month, increased the cost per gallon at American filling stations by more than $1. Here is where the picture stands based on the data that is available and verifiable. The national average retail price of gasoline in the United States crossed $4 per gallon for the first time since August 2022, according to GasBuddy tracking data. Prices have risen $1.06 per gallon, 36%, since the launch of U.S.-Israeli operations against Iran. U.S. crude futures settled at $102.88 per barrel on Monday, following fresh incident reports from Gulf shipping lanes. 55% of Americans surveyed report that rising fuel costs have affected their household finances. The Jones Act waiver, implemented as an administrative response, is assessed by industry analysts as having only marginal price impact. The political timeline places midterm elections 7 months from now, within the window where sustained elevated fuel prices would produce measurable electoral consequences based on the historical pattern from 2022. And the energy market variables that would need to shift to relieve current price pressure, Hormuz shipping lane status, Gulf LNG production resumption, and crude supply trajectory, are not currently moving toward resolution. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. When crude prices cross the next threshold that commodity analysts have identified as the trigger for structural consumer behavior change, the analysis will be here. When the political consequences of sustained $4+ gasoline begin appearing in congressional approval polling that the administration cannot manage by messaging, the analysis will be here. When the Jones Act waiver fails to produce the price relief that its implementation implied, and the administration is required to identify an alternative response, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always.